Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical, laboratory, and life safety and security businesses at Intertech. Today, I am so thrilled to be joined by Hannah Gibson, founder of Diverse Integration, and very excited to have Hannah, who is a friend and ex-colleague from Intertech. So welcome to the podcast, Hannah.
Thank you, Clarissa. I'm super excited to be here and to talk about the topic that I love and I'm very passionate about.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you here to talk about this as well. But before we get into it, would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit and maybe tell people more about what Diverse Integration is as the founder and what you've been doing.
Sure. So Diverse Integration is a disability inclusion consultancy business, and I'm actually working across industries to create a world where everyone belongs. That's my mission, and it's what I'm really passionate about. And that includes things like transport being an enabler and not a limitation, and everyone having access to basic needs. And it spans right across business, education, and culture. Now, my personal experience, which I think is really important to point out, is that I have a degenerative eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa. It's a very long word, but it's RP for short. And essentially how that presents itself in me is a narrowing of the field of vision. So you get tunnel vision, and I can't see in dim light or low light. So I have total blindness in those cases. So I've lived as a sighted person, and I'm currently a severely sight impaired person, which in the UK is registered blind. So I'm extremely fortunate to experience life in these two different ways. And I think having gone through those experiences and coupling that with the career that I've had at Intertech, working with all of you guys, I got to the point where I reflected on, the success that I'd had and thought, if I'd have had the eyesight I have now as a younger, less formed lady, would I have got to where I got to? And I think the answer to that is unfortunately at the moment no, because there's so many systemic barriers in place through society. So my mission, and I choose to accept it, is to take all of those away.
It really truly is. It's so amazing, Hannah. I think you're right. You do have such an interesting perspective and so much empathy that you can share as well. Obviously, being from both sides of the spectrum and experiencing things in both ways. And I think you make such a good point that people maybe in their day-to-day life just aren't considering all of these different elements. And it's not just, in one area or another, right? It's how it impacts your overall life from a work perspective, from a personal perspective, from a transportation perspective, right? Just living and existing in the day-to-day world. So I'd love to talk a little bit about, when we think about this disability population and what that looks like. I think it's much broader maybe than people think. I think there's a lot more that's maybe inclusive in that term. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Love to. So on this, I am going to start with a really interesting fact, Clarissa. And actually, I found this really interesting when I discovered this through my research. And it's one of the big reasons why we're here today. So without this person that I'm going to talk about in a moment, you and I probably wouldn't even be on this call today discussing what we're discussing. And that person is your founding father, Thomas Edison. So he, I don't know if you know this, but he was actually disabled. So
okay, tell me.
So Thomas Edison is so well known, obviously, for his amazing inventions and everything he did with the phonograph and the commercially viable electric light bulb and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he was hearing impaired in both ears. So he could partially hear through both his ears. So whether he was formally deaf, I think he was probably deaf with a little d. And he was also chronically diabetic. Now, the reason that I find this really interesting is, and it feeds back into the framing and the mindset of how we are considering people with disabilities, right? Because there is so many amazing people in the world with all levels of abilities and people that have contributed to society that people don't even recognize are
Mhm.
actually in that category, if you want to call it a category. So when we think about the size of the disability population globally, and this is always really interesting, 1.3 billion people in the world are registered as having a disability, which is about 1 in 6. So it's a really big number. But actually, when you think about that from even a UK perspective, we're around 1 in 4, so 25% of the UK population. And I think the US is around 26%, so you're just slightly higher than us. So the numbers are huge. I think the US is around 61 million people, and the UK is, I think, just under 17 million. Now, when I talk about this to businesses and organizations, and I always start at this level, people are really shocked about this number because, quite rightly, a lot of people are like, where are all these disabled people? Why aren't the streets flooded with white canes and hearing aids and guide dogs and wheelchairs? It's because 80% of disabilities are hidden, right? They're invisible. Um, and they're not, they're not easily detectable. And what that means, I think, in this sector specifically, is that it's very easy for this topic to be overlooked because it's not obvious.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, right? And I think there's a lot of reasons, and when you say that they're hidden, and I think people sometimes do things to mask them as well, right? So it's not only that they're maybe hidden by nature, but also that people maybe feel stigmatized in some ways, and so they hide those things.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say, oh, 1 in 4, 25% of people, right? You would expect that people would be talking about this all the time, that it would be integrated into everything we do, right? From thinking about like a traditional like care facility in a medical setting, or thinking about getting onto a form of transportation or going to a restaurant, right? You would think that if it's impacting 25% of the population, we would be seeing these things more and more, but that really just isn't the case, right? I mean, so you think as existing as one of these people, what that means for you kind of going through your day to day, trying to access any sort of service or any sort of care or do just anything in your day to day life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think the stark reality is that this number is really, really high, but the actual number of people that are affected by disability, chronic long-term illness is much, much bigger. So
Mhm.
I'm working with an organization at the moment, and they've done a big self-ID program, and that has, the results of that have been astounding. So it's actually come out at around 70% of their workforce. And I don't think that that would be uncommon. I think if a lot of organisations did that self-ID process, it would be coming out quite similar. But that to one side, the official numbers of disability are very, very high. And I think, going back to the Thomas Edison piece, it's about people reframing, I think, how they perceive people with disabilities as well. I think there's a very low expectation that people have around people with disabilities, and what their needs are, what their aspirations are. But there is so many amazing inventors, collaborators, money makers, entertainers in our world that have been and are now that have disabilities, but people just don't necessarily associate them with that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of accessibility, right? So as I said, we see it a lot in the medical space. We see it a lot on the intertech side in general, right? As we're seeing products that are being developed and things that are targeted more towards being accessible to different types of people, different populations, people who maybe have disabilities, right? So let's talk a little bit when we say accessibility and what it means and why accessibility, right? When we're thinking about it in kind of more of a generic term.
Yeah, I mean, it like accessibility as a definition, if you like, has changed so much over the
Mhm.
years. So, in its real early stages, it was very much about an individual with an impairment, and it was seen in that medical model, and it was very charity based. So
Mhm.
you would have minor adaptations to somebody who was blind or deaf or in a wheelchair. It was very crude at that level. And I think as one of the actually I do a quiz in one of my workshops, and one of the questions I ask in there is, which major world event helped to accelerate accessibility rehabilitation, and it was the World War II, because there were so many people that came back from that, so many young men that came back, and women, but a lot of men with missing limbs, complex PTSD, mental health issues. But the reality was we needed everybody to be able to contribute to society in order to get the economy up and running again, and to get the world moving again. So it was prioritized because it was seen as so significant. So then the narrative started to change from medical needs to contribution. And then it evolved again. If we look at some of the legislation that started to come in, it started to move from that medical model into a more societal model. So there wasn't something necessarily wrong with that person. Accessibility wasn't about fixing that broken person. It was about recognizing the systemic barriers that are in society that stops that person from accessing what it is that they need to access. And with that kind of cultural shift and the legislation that's coming through, I think that's where we're starting to see some really big positive changes. And that's only going to improve as there's more focus on digital accessibility with, web content accessibility guidelines as an example, and with artificial intelligence coming through as well. I can only see this it's moving in the right direction for sure.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you say that too, right? Because we think about the medical industry in general and like the traditional thought of it of, oh, I'm seeking care, I'm going to a doctor's office, or, oh, I'm seeking care, I'm going to a hospital because I need it. And now it's just integrated into day-to-day life, right? People care more about their own personal health, right? Your health journey and what you're doing. It's not just in a traditional sense anymore. So I think how this goes hand in hand, right, is really interesting when you see the accessibility model as you're talking about as well, right? It's not just, oh, in one specific instance, or you are a disabled person, but it's now integrated into how can we make life and, moving through the day-to-day more accessible for all. And I think that's exactly hand in hand with the shift that we've seen in healthcare as well, which is now, people are considering their health all day long and everything that they're doing, right? Monitoring it by, smartwatches and step counters and all of the biometrics that they're taking, right? And so it's this idea that hopefully as a society, right, people are trying to move towards something where it's more integrated and less, oh, this is what you're doing when you're seeking care, and then this is what you're doing when you're living in your day-to-day.
Yeah, yeah. And it's so important what you're touching on, because if you think about the aging population now that we have, across workforces, and that's a productivity issue, right? And that's why accessibility is so important in the workplace. But if you think about it in the context that you're talking about it, we are living longer. We have more control and management over our health conditions. We're working longer. And that demographic is now going to control the majority of the disposable income. I think the stat is around 63p in every pound in the UK by 2030 will be spent by somebody in that demographic. And so, the point of that is there's a higher expectation now to how people want to live their lives. It's not just about living it independently, but they still want to, fit into society. They still want to have a home that feels and looks the way that they want it to, rather than having to be kind of styled in a medical way because of a condition.
I think you used the word really perfectly, right? Like crude modifications before, right? So things that were very clearly modified for someone who maybe couldn't use it in a traditional sense, right? And so this idea of, as you're saying, right, people want to feel like they're living in exactly the same way. They don't want to have that feeling of, oh, I have something that's specialized because I'm suffering from X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, absolutely. And I moved through that myself with, various different things. And I've talked about this a lot recently with, barriers in the home. If you can, and especially with, personal medical devices, but across all of the devices that you'll find in your home, if you can help to remove those barriers in somebody's home, whether that be managing their medical condition, giving them access to create their own meals, do their own washing, manage their household, the confidence and the empowerment that gives to somebody to then go out into the world and tackle those barriers, right? Whether that be, contributing in community, getting a job, going to art classes, whatever it is that you want to do. It's so important.
Yeah, and I think that you touch on something there too, right? Which is, if things are not made in a way that people can use them, people won't use them, right? Which is so critical
Mm,
in the healthcare system. So if you are dealing with a chronic condition, and you said that perfectly, right? There's so many people who are also, living with disabilities or with long-term chronic conditions. And if you have devices or things that you're supposed to be using, but they're not accessible and it's not easy to use, I mean, the research is
mm,
astounding, right? People won't use it, right? It'll sit in a closet, it'll get
yeah.
shut somewhere. Someone's not going to take it out and use it. And so this idea of, thinking about human factors, thinking about usability, but also thinking about accessibility, right? All kind of woven together into one single strategy, right? When you're developing these products, because you want
Mm,
people to not only use them, you want them to want to use them, right? And actually make them in an effective way. So I think that's so true when you think about someone's like personal ecosystem in their home and what they're doing, right? How all of these things integrate so they can, as you say, live a fulfilling life on the inside and then go out into the world and do whatever they want to do without feeling that, hindrance by some sort of condition.
yeah. And it's not even a them and us conversation, because the reality is that, every single one of us will probably experience a disability of sorts in our lifetime, whether that's on a
Absolutely.
temporary or permanent basis. So, a lot of when I get objections, when I'm talking to manufacturers sometimes, about how small the people, the population is that requires this. I mean, we just talked about a lot of the numbers and the stats there, but ultimately, I think sometimes people think that this isn't going to affect them, and it will. That's just the reality
100%
of the
will. Yeah.
situation. But there's the sustainability aspect, right? And there's doing the right thing, and that's super important, because we need everyone in the world to be able to contribute. When we look at the Thomas Edisons, the Stephen Hawkings, the Albert Einsteins, the Richard Bransons, Steve Wynn. I mean, I could just rattle off so
Yeah.
many of people that have, they've been really tenacious to contribute. But how many other people are out there that are like the next 1,000 Thomas Edisons that are sitting there that can't contribute because they've got barriers in the way, right? And the world's missing out on that contribution. But
Yeah. I
that to
think
one side.
yeah.
Sorry, go on. Go
No,
on.
no, no, please, please.
I was just going to say that to one side, there's a massive business angle here as well, because as we said earlier, with the aging population, they will have a huge amount of the disposable income moving as we move forwards. But the disability community and the purple pound, that market is massive. So this is the disposable income of people with disabilities and their families. And in the UK, that's worth £274 billion. Globally, is about 13 trillion. Absolutely huge. And if you think about 20, let's just say 20% of the population, right, depending on where you sit, of people having a significant disability, and every single one of those people having two loved ones, which is, atypical more, you started to look at 75% of the population. And when people buy or use products in their homes, not necessarily personal medical products, but all products, they're multi-generational, multi-ability households. So when if my mum is buying an appliance, for instance, and my dad has the same eyesight as me, she will buy something that he is able to use. It has to be accessible, even though she doesn't need that accessibility herself.
Exactly. That's such a good point, right? When you're thinking about it from a business and a product development standpoint, right? When people are bringing products to market, that's so true, right? You have to think about the consumer. And as you say, just because I might not have a limited vision, but if the person that I'm living with does, of course you're going to buy one that then that person can use, right? So I think that's such a good example in a way to frame it and think about it. So when a manufacturer is like, oh, well, this condition only affects X number of people, you have to think of it in a more broad sense, right? And think about it from the consumer side as well. I think that's such an interesting thing to note because, it can be easy to get narrow focused and to say, oh, well, only, X number of the population is impacted by this. But you're right, it becomes so much bigger than that.
Yeah, yeah. Amplified human functionality, I think, is a term that a lot of people are using in that kind of design thought process. We've seen it a lot. I think we saw it a lot at CES over the past couple of years.
Yeah.
As well, which is really, really interesting. But ultimately, if you're innovating for the amplified human functionality, the pointy ends of the bell curve, you're going to get better products and better innovations, full stop. We've seen it in the market. A lot of the big successful brands in the market today are building accessibility into their products. And, I did talk recently where it was actually a Teen Tech Awards. It was very cute. All these children coming together and innovating. It was brilliant. But I talked about I was going on holiday to Sicily, and I said, when I'm there, I will be laying on the beach, sipping a cocktail, and I'll be reading an audiobook. An audiobooks is something that we all benefit from, great contribution to society, but they were originally invented for blind people, actually by the American Federation of the Blind. So we have the Americans to thank for that. But that's a really good example of innovation for different abilities, creating products that just make everybody's lives better.
Yeah. Become that so streamlined too, right? No one would make that connection now, right? Because everyone listens to audiobooks, right? On planes, on the beach, like you're saying, right? Walking outside, right? It's so common that it would be very, you would talk to anybody and they would not make that connection and say, oh, this wasn't just created for every single consumer, because it's a great benefit to not have to carry a book with me and to not have to hold it out and to be able to be laying or walking or driving the car and be able to listen and read at the same time. So I think that's such a great example. Are there other examples of innovations that you can think of that were either designed for people with disabilities that have become more mainstream, or were designed by people with disabilities? Like anything that, I think that's such a great story. Are there any others that you think of or that come to mind?
There are so many, Clarissa. I'd probably take up we could do a whole podcast just on this, but some electric toothbrushes. That's one. The bendy straw, that was actually invented by, they're not very sustainable now, right? So they shouldn't be plastic. But originally invented by a father for his daughter, who put a nail into the straw and then wrapped cord around it to create the bendy straw. Basically, very infamous. Voiceover, that originally came from disability. The keyboard, so the typewriter of which the keyboard is born, for disability, dropped curbs that we all benefit from, lifts in train stations. There is just so many, but because they're so integrated in our society, right, in the best way, in the way that these designs should be, they shouldn't feel and look different and stand out. They should blend and create a better world for everyone, which is what these innovations do. And then I think the other point to your question was about disabled entrepreneurs and innovators. Ralph Teeter, cruise control, Nikolai Tesla, obviously you Intertech know a lot about him. Thomas Edison, we've covered, Richard Branson, very famous entrepreneur with neurodivergence. Who else have we got now? I've covered Albert Einstein, haven't I? So again, a lot of neurodivergence, which is quite interesting. But I think if you go through a lot of is it part of being able to, is this part of the superpower of thinking differently, perceiving the world differently, that enables these big innovations? But if you look at a lot of the big entrepreneurs, innovators, inventors, they have a level of disability. Beethoven, was deaf, went deaf. And that's quite famous because he was in a film. But his ability to continue composing using vibration it just astounds me actually what we're capable of when we actually tap into all of our senses.
Yeah, I think that's so true. That's such a powerful statement too, right? And it's just, as you said, when these innovations are developed and they become part of mainstream life and there's no difference, right? But they're these amazing things that provide so much inclusivity and accessibility for all, that when you think about some of these innovations that are coming and how people can think really big when they're developing products or developing solutions and what that can do for our society. Now, I know we haven't talked too much about it, but there of course are some regulations that exist that impact how people are designing and manufacturing product to meet the American Disabilities Act or the European Accessibility Act. So, we see some of those things that are out there that should push for manufacturers when they're thinking about what their concepts are for a new product. Do you see that these are enough with the regulations that exist currently? Are we seeing that, manufacturers should be looking further than that from a performance standpoint, or thinking bigger than just complying with those requirements of the ADA or the EAA or some of the other regulations that exist?
I mean, listen, I'm not going to be a naysayer here when it comes to the level of regulation that we currently have for accessibility, because it is a journey, right? And we are on that journey as a society, and the fact that the European Accessibility Act has been put into place now and is actually active as of June this year, is fantastic. So we've got, it's like the American People with Disabilities Act, you've got the European Accessibility Act across the globe. There's different areas. You've got Australia, I've got, I think it's the Disability Discrimination Act. They're very patchy. The issue I have, I mean, it's great that they're happening, right? And this is going in the right direction. And the EAA is certainly being a lot more pointed in the fact that, it is going to be enforced by the market surveillance authorities in Europe and in all the different member states. That's really important. Public procurement, they will not be able to purchase products now that aren't accessible. Really important, because you're starting to get these financial penalties on companies as well. It directly affects market access. They have to do a declaration of conformity. That in itself is going to challenge the thinking of a lot of these businesses. So it's a really good forward step, I would say, the EAA regulation. What I would say is that there's a lot of voluntary compliance globally with these regulations. And what I would like to see is not necessarily more penalties, right? Because that's not necessarily what's going to inspire and move people forwards. I think it's how do we create more learning, more awareness, more training, more standards for guidance. A lot of these regulations and legislations, they can be a little bit loose, and actually makes it quite difficult for manufacturers or organizations to really understand what it is that they need to do. And of course, the best way for them to do that is to actually work with people who have lived experiences. Like, that's always going to be the gold standard of being accessible. So my thought process is, Clarissa, is great that these are there and they're happening. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in the enforcement space and on the procurement space globally to kind of really push accessibility through the supply chains.
Yeah. Before we close, I'd like to touch on that a little more, because I think you made some really key observations there, right? When we're thinking about people who are designing these products, designers, engineers, new product development, right? You say, some of these regulations can be a bit vague, right? They're not pointing to exactly what a manufacturer needs to be doing. So that can be difficult on the front end, right? When they're trying to build products that are accessible or inclusive. You talked a little bit about, the need to be including people who are living with those conditions as part of your design process, so you understand your target user, right? So are there other things that you see as challenges for these designers or engineers, or things that they could be doing differently to be really thinking about this and integrating this as a normal part of their process when they're developing products going forward?
Yeah, I think one of the conversations I've probably had the most is actually down to the organizational strategies. Where there's a disconnect between the R&D teams and the organizational strategy is where does accessibility and inclusivity sit in that? Because if it's not in the DNA of that organization, it's not being fed through in the early stages of the R&D process. And then what's happening is they're trying to bolt it onto the back end of the design process. And that's where you're not getting that true accessibility, because it's an afterthought. So if it's an afterthought in the organization at a really high level, in the leadership, in the policies and procedures and the mission and vision of that organization, it becomes an afterthought in the design process. And as a designer, if the priority of the organization isn't to create accessible, inclusive products, their priorities are going to be time, cost. A lot of designers are under such extreme time pressures to get new designs out and new products into the manufacturing process. And actually, it's not allowing for the time that they need to educate themselves. I mean, that needs to happen. All of that within the engineering, the education of these engineers and designers before they even come into business. It should be happening at that level and within the syllabuses. But two, co-creation, as we touched on earlier, the co-creation is so important. If there's not time built into the design process for them to do that, that's going to become a barrier. That's why it needs to be done up front. And then just quickly on the cost. Now, I have very mixed opinions on this. I feel like cost sometimes can be a really easy go-to reason for accessibility. But a lot of times, and actually most times, it doesn't actually cost more. It is not about adding more in. In fact, a lot of the times it's about taking stuff out, especially from a angle of simplicity. Some things have got so overcomplicated and so over-engineered trying to be accessible, they've almost missed the point.
Yeah.
So I think cost is more of it's a subjective barrier. It's not actually I'm not sure it's actually a real barrier.
Well, super interesting. So Hannah, before we close here, where can everybody find you if they want to talk more about this topic? It's something that is so important. We see, more and more conversations being had. So where can everybody find you?
I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. So Hannah Gibson, find me on there. I also have a website, which is www.diverseintegration.com. And yeah, you can contact me there. And as you can tell, I'm very happy to talk about this all day, every day. And if anybody wants support on training, awareness, consultancy, then they can reach out to me and we can connect.
Yes, such an important topic, and you can just tell how passionate you are about it. So thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Clarissa. It's been a pleasure.